This story is titled, She Believed I'd Betray Her. No matter how much I loved her, it was never enough to erase her doubt. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment when my wife's joy was replaced by quiet unease, when the excitement of expecting our first child together started twisting into something darker. At first, I thought she was just overwhelmed by the changes happening to her body, by the reality of becoming a mother, by the natural fears that creep in when you realize life is about to shift in ways you can't fully predict. But it wasn't just that. There was something in the way she looked at me now, something guarded, hesitant, like she was waiting for a storm to hit. It was in the way her laughter became rarer, and how her body stiffened whenever I picked up my phone, in the silence that stretched between us at night, when she used to curl into me as if the space between us didn't exist. It felt as though she was watching me, searching for signs of something I couldn't name. And even before she spoke, I could feel it. Doubt. I hadn't done anything. Not one thing to make her question me. I had loved her with everything in me from the moment we met, had devoted myself to her happiness in ways I hadn't even known I was capable of before she came into my life. And yet, there it was, pressing between us like a wall I hadn't built but was now expected to tear down, brick by brick. When she finally let it slip, when she hesitated before telling me what had been haunting her, I felt the weight of it settle into my bones. My mother had spoken to her. That alone should have been enough of a warning. It had happened over coffee, casual in a way that didn't seem dangerous on the surface. My wife had been glowing. She had told me she was looking forward to bonding with my mother now that we were starting a family, that maybe this would be a turning point in what had always been a strained relationship. She had been hopeful. She had been open. And my mother, with the kind of bitterness that had been simmering for decades, had taken that opening and planted something deep inside my wife's mind, something that had begun to fester the moment it took root. She told me your father cheated on her when she was pregnant. The words had come out quietly, carefully, as if saying them too loudly might make them more real. I had known it. The moment I saw the change in her, I had known my mother had something to do with it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before responding. That's not exactly true, I told her, my voice even, careful. I knew that every word mattered now, that the next thing I said would either begin to mend the wound my mother had created or drive it even deeper. He didn't know she was pregnant yet. It was the truth, but it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. She nodded, but it was the kind of nod that didn't mean acceptance. It meant she was absorbing the information, adding it to the storm already raging inside her. And I realized then that she wasn't just afraid of history repeating itself. She was convinced that it already was. I saw it in the way she reacted whenever my phone buzzed, the way her fingers clenched slightly when I told her I had to stay late at work, the way she lingered when I came home, watching me as if searching for signs of guilt, of deceit, of something she hadn't found yet but was certain would surface if she just looked hard enough. She told me she trusted me, but I could feel the lie in it. Not because she meant to deceive me, but because she was trying so hard to convince herself that it was true. She wanted to trust me. I could see that. But somewhere deep inside her, a voice was whispering that trust was dangerous, that love didn't mean security, that the moment she let her guard down, she would be the fool who hadn't seen it coming. And my mother wasn't helping. It had taken me years to understand the kind of resentment my mother carried, the way betrayal had settled into her skin and never quite left. Even now, decades later, she still spat my father's name like it burned her tongue. She never forgave him. She never moved on. And instead of keeping that bitterness locked inside, she let it spill over, poisoning everything around her, including my wife. She should be careful, my mother had told her, voice laced with something sharp, something cutting. Men can't help themselves sometimes, especially when they know they have a woman at home who won't be the same after the baby. I hadn't been there when she said it, but I could hear it as clearly as if I had. And my wife, my beautiful, wonderful wife, had let those words wrap around her, suffocating the joy she should have been feeling. She wasn't just afraid of losing me. She was afraid of what she thought was inevitable. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to storm over to my mother's house and demand to know why she would do this, why she would take my wife's happiness and crush it beneath her heel just because she couldn't let go of the past. But more than anything, I just felt exhausted. How do you fight a ghost? How do you prove that you won't turn into something that's been haunting someone their entire life? Because that's what I was up against. I wasn't just fighting my mother's words, my father's mistakes, or even my wife's own painful past. I was fighting something bigger, an idea, a fear, a certainty that had taken root long before I ever had the chance to stop it. And I didn't know if love would be enough to pull us through. There's something uniquely devastating about realizing that the person you love most in the world, the one you've spent years building a life with, no longer sees you the way they once did. It's not an immediate shift, not the kind of thing that happens overnight or in a single conversation, but rather a slow erosion, an almost imperceptible change in the way their eyes linger on you, in the pauses between their words, in the way they hold themselves slightly apart, as if they're waiting for confirmation that the fear they've been harboring is real. At first, I convinced myself that if I just loved her enough, reassured her enough, showed up every single day as the man she had always known me to be, then the doubt would disappear. I told myself that this was temporary, that my mother's words had simply shaken her, that with time, she would come back to me fully, that the anxiety creeping into our marriage would dissipate once she saw that there was no reason to hold on to it. But the truth that I had been trying so hard to avoid, was that once suspicion takes hold, it doesn't simply vanish. It lingers, sinking into the spaces between two people, filling every silence with unspoken questions, twisting even the most ordinary moments into something fragile, something dangerous. She still told me she loved me, still curled up next to me at night, still reached for my hand absent-mindedly when we walked together, but I could feel the hesitancy there, the way her fingers no longer tightened around mine the way they used to, the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever I picked up my phone, as if bracing herself for the moment she would discover that her worst fears were not fears at all, but a reality she had simply been too blind to see. I started noticing the way she would ask casual questions about my day that didn't feel casual at all, the way she would glance at my phone screen when it lit up, the way her body would tense slightly if I mentioned a female coworker in passing. And even though she tried to mask it, tried to pretend that nothing had changed, I could see it in her eyes, the way she was waiting, searching, anticipating the inevitable heartbreak she had convinced herself was coming. I had never given her a reason to doubt me, not once in all the years we had been together. I had been the one who stayed, who showed up, who committed to her with everything I had, but somehow, that no longer seemed to matter. In her mind, it wasn't about what I had done or hadn't done. It was about what I might do, about what she had seen happen before, about the stories she had been told, about the warnings that had been whispered into her ear by a woman who had spent decades trapped in the bitterness of her own past. And my mother, my own mother, had only made it worse. I knew she resented my father, knew she had never forgiven him for the way he had betrayed her, but what I hadn't realized was just how much she was still holding on to it, how much she had allowed that resentment to define the way she saw me. And now, rather than letting me build my own life, my own marriage, my own identity, she had chosen to remind me, and more importantly, my wife, of the blood that ran through my veins, of the history I had no control over, of the man she had convinced herself I would eventually become. She had told my wife to be careful, that men couldn't help themselves, that I was, after all, my father's son. And I hated her for it, because now, no matter what I did, no matter how many times I told my wife that she was the only woman I had ever wanted, that there would never be anyone else, that she was my home, my family, my entire world, there would always be a voice in the back of her mind whispering that love wasn't enough to keep a man faithful. I tried to be patient, tried to remind myself that she wasn't doing this on purpose, that she wasn't choosing to doubt me, that fear isn't rational, that it doesn't always listen to reason. I told myself that the best thing I could do was to keep loving her through it, to keep showing her day after day that I wasn't going anywhere. But love is not a cure for fear. And the longer this went on, the more I could feel something inside me beginning to crack. I had never been the kind of man who needed constant validation, had never felt the need to prove myself in relationships, because I had always believed that trust should be the foundation of love, that without it, nothing else really mattered. But now, I found myself walking on eggshells, second-guessing every move I made, wondering whether something as simple as an unread text message or a delayed response would be enough to set off another spiral of suspicion. It was exhausting. And more than that, it was starting to make me resent her. Because no matter how much I loved her, no matter how much I wanted to understand, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that I was being punished for something I hadn't even done, that I was being held responsible for the sins of my father, for the mistakes of men I had never even met, for the ghosts that haunted her past and my mother's. I wanted to scream at her that she was pushing me away, that the thing she feared most, the idea of me becoming distant, of me withdrawing from her, was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because how do you stay close to someone who refuses to believe that you aren't the enemy? How do you fight for a love that is slowly being poisoned by something beyond your control? I kept hoping she would see it, That she would wake up one day and realize that she was tearing us apart with her fears. That she would understand that by trying so hard to prevent heartbreak, she was ensuring it. But every time I thought we had made progress, every time I saw a flicker of the woman I had fallen in love with, the one who trusted me implicitly, something would happen to remind me that the doubt was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest excuse to rise back up. And the worst part was, I was beginning to wonder if I could really blame her for it. Because what if she was right? What if all men did eventually give in to temptation? What if I was fooling myself into believing that I was different, that I could outrun the history that had been laid out before me? What if the weight of her expectations, the constant pressure of proving my loyalty, the never-ending cycle of defending myself against a crime I hadn't even committed, what if all of it eventually became too much? What if one day I became exactly what she was afraid of? There comes a point in every storm where you stop waiting for the rain to pass, where you realize that no matter how desperately you try to hold on to the foundation beneath you, the ground is shifting, cracking in places too deep to repair. You tell yourself you can fix it, that with enough patience, with enough love, you can hold everything together. But at some point, you have to face the truth. Love cannot exist where trust has already died. I didn't want to believe it. I had fought against the very idea, convincing myself that the doubt twisting itself around my wife's heart was just a phase, a temporary shadow that would fade with time. I kept telling myself that if I just held on long enough, if I just showed up every single day and reminded her who I was, reminded her who we were, then eventually, the fear would loosen its grip on her and she would come back to me fully, as she had been before. But the reality, the one I had been refusing to acknowledge, was that the woman I had married, the one who had once loved me without hesitation, without question, without conditions, was already gone. The realization didn't come in a single moment. It wasn't some grand revelation, some dramatic event that shattered the illusion all at once. No, it came in pieces, small, almost unnoticeable things that, on their own, meant little but together painted a picture I could no longer ignore. It was in the way she always seemed to be holding her breath, waiting for the inevitable confirmation of her fears. It was in the way her eyes lingered just a second too long whenever my phone lit up, as if bracing herself for the betrayal she was convinced would come. It was in the way she asked about my day, not with curiosity, but with an edge of suspicion, as if she was searching for inconsistencies, for something that would finally give her permission to believe the worst. And the truth, the part I could no longer deny, was that I had started to resent her for it. I had spent so much time trying to understand, trying to be patient, trying to remind myself that this wasn't about me, that it wasn't a reflection of anything I had done, but rather a manifestation of her own past, of her own wounds, of the scars left behind by people who had failed her long before I ever stepped into her life. But understanding didn't make it easier. Understanding didn't take away the exhaustion of constantly feeling like I was on trial for a crime I hadn't committed, of having to prove, over and over again, that I wasn't my father, that I wasn't the men who had hurt her, that I wasn't some ticking time bomb waiting to explode into betrayal the moment she let her guard down. I wanted to shake her, to force her to see what she was doing, to make her understand that by trying so hard to protect herself, she was destroying us in the process. But more than that, I wanted to stop feeling like I was suffocating inside my own marriage. I wanted to stop feeling like no matter what I did, no matter how much I loved her, it would never be enough to make her believe in me again. The breaking point came on a night like any other, one of those quiet evenings where everything felt deceptively normal. I had come home late, not by choice, but because work had run over, and the moment I walked through the door, I could see it in her face, the tightness in her jaw, the way she was gripping her phone just a little too hard, the way she was looking at me like she was already forming the accusations in her mind. And I knew. I knew before she even spoke that she had been sitting there, counting the minutes, building up all the worst-case scenarios in her head. She tried to hide it at first, pretending like nothing was wrong, but I could feel it, the tension hanging between us like a blade waiting to drop. And when she finally said it, when she finally let the words slip about how she just didn't understand why I had been out so late, how she just wanted to be sure, how she was just asking because she had the right to know, something inside me snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't get angry. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply felt empty, because that was the moment I realized that nothing I said would ever be enough, that no amount of reassurances, no amount of honesty, no amount of love would ever erase the doubt that had taken root in her heart. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been too afraid to consider before. Was this the rest of my life? Was this what our marriage had become? A constant battle to prove that I wasn't someone she had already decided I was? And if that was the case, then what was the point? I had spent so long trying to hold on, trying to convince myself that if I just loved her enough, she would see me again. Not the version of me her fears had created, but the real me, the one who had never given her a reason to doubt in the first place. But that night, standing in our home, staring at the woman who used to trust me with everything but now flinched every time my phone buzzed, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for her anymore. I was fighting for a marriage that no longer existed, and suddenly I didn't know if I had the strength to keep fighting. There's a quiet kind of grief that settles in when you realize love alone isn't enough to save something that's already broken. It's not sudden, not a dramatic moment where everything shatters at once, but rather a slow unraveling, a series of quiet realizations that pile up until they're impossible to ignore. I had spent so long convincing myself that if I just kept showing up, if I just kept proving my love, the fear in my wife's eyes would eventually fade. But some things, no matter how much you try, cannot be undone. For weeks, I walked on eggshells, measuring every word, every action, as if I could somehow avoid triggering another spiral of doubt. But it was never about what I did or didn't do. It was about the story she had already written in her mind, the one where I was destined to betray her, just like the men before me. And the truth, the one I had been too afraid to admit, was that I had started to resent her for it. The breaking point wasn't an argument, wasn't some dramatic explosion of emotions. It was quiet. A simple conversation over dinner where I asked if she still believed in us, if she still saw a future where we weren't living in the shadow of her fears. And the hesitation in her response, the way she struggled to meet my gaze, told me everything I needed to know. She loved me, I never doubted that, but love should not feel like waiting for a disaster to happen. Love should not be a constant battle to prove your innocence before you've even been accused. Love should be safe, certain, something you run toward, not something you brace yourself for. And so, for the first time, I stopped trying to convince her. I stopped fighting to prove I was someone she should trust. Instead, I told her the truth. I couldn't live my life like this anymore. I couldn't spend forever carrying the weight of a crime I had never committed. She cried, so did I. But in the end, there was nothing left to say. No grand reconciliation, no sudden revelation that made everything right again. Just silence. And the painful understanding that some things, no matter how much love is left, cannot be saved. We are separated now. Not because I stopped loving her, but because I finally loved myself enough to walk away. And maybe one day she will realize that the man she feared I would become never existed at all. But either way, I am free.
He's superior.